Morning, all. All right, so doing something a little different to start things off today. 32 team video. I want to talk about 32 players that I feel like are underrated. And some teams it was easier to find a player. Some teams it was really difficult. But I was like, I have to find one for each team. And we'll go through this. There's some defensive defensemen on this list, some depth forwards, and some guys that I just feel like at this point in time in their career are a bit underrated. So there's some veterans on this list too. Really kind of a mix of everybody. We'll start off with the Toronto Maple Leafs. For Toronto, I'm going with Mark Giordano. Now, Toronto's blue line is underrated, but Mark Giordano had an excellent season for them this past year. He is not, Norris level at this stage of his career. He's definitely winding things down, but he was excellent for Toronto this past season. And yeah, I mean, the numbers show that he's still a very good top four defenseman in the National Hockey League. And again, Toronto's defense takes a lot of criticism. I don't always feel like that's fair. I talked about that in the video yesterday, where the depth scoring in the playoffs has been a problem for them. I feel like more than the defense or just the top four guys not getting the points. So Giordano, a big part of what I think is a strong defense. Again, just the defense in general is underrated. I just could put defense really for them. Tampa Bay, going with Brandon Hagel. Now, some teams it's tough to find players that I feel are actually underrated. And for me with Tampa Bay and Toronto, it is difficult because Toronto gets all kinds of attention all the time. And Tampa Bay's had a lot of attention because they've been in the Stanley Cup final and won some cups, and people pay attention to them as well. Hagel had a 30-goal season this year. I still feel like he's a bit underrated. Now, I don't know if he scores 30 goals again this coming year, but he's been fantastic since arriving in Tampa. He was excellent in Chicago as well, but that was overshadowed by the fact the Hawks just weren't very good. And so I think Hagel went under the radar a bit. I'm not saying he's under the radar, but do I think he's still underrated a little bit? Yeah, absolutely. For Montreal, Justin Barron. We talk a lot about the blue line in Montreal, and Jack Eye gets a lot of attention because he fights and he hits, and he's an exciting young player to watch. Caden Gooley, of course, a lot of attention on him. It feels like there's less attention on Barron. I also considered Harris for this, but I thought, no, I'm going with Justin Barron. I think Barron's got some tremendous upside there, part of a very talented blue line in Montreal. It's a young blue line that's going to make some mistakes, but this blue line grows over the years, I think Montreal could have a really, really solid top six, and hoping Barron's in the top four when they get there. So, yeah, I would go with Barron. For Boston, Boston's not an easy one either, but I'm going with Swayman. So Swayman right now is a restricted free agent, and he's going through arbitration in all likelihood, unless Boston can sign him to an extension before that arbitration date arrives. Swayman takes a lot of blame in Boston when he has a bad game. I feel like Swayman being compared to the season Ullmark just had was kind of unfair. And while Ullmark had a ridiculously good year, they should be 1A, 1B in Boston. I think Swayman, did he have a down year? I don't think so. I think he had a pretty good year, and I think that'll continue, and he is going to be a starter for Boston, I think, sooner rather than later. For Buffalo, Buffalo was kind of a difficult one, too. But I went back and forth on this, and I'll go with Alex Tuck. And I'm going to go with Alex Tuck because I think even though we know how strong the offense is for Buffalo, I don't know if Tuck gets enough credit in there. Since arriving from the Vegas Golden Knights, and of course he arrived, he was damaged goods when he arrived. He didn't debut with Buffalo until it was a while after the season started. But yeah, Tuck's been absolutely fantastic when he's played for Buffalo. If he can stay healthy, he can be in the 85, 90 point range, which is insane. Because I thought in Vegas he was really a lot of speed, some skill there, and I thought, yeah, 20, 25 goals, maybe 45 points, sure. No, in Buffalo, those numbers have gone up, and he has really shown he's a really solid all-around player. For Ottawa, Ottawa was difficult because a lot of guys had down years, or there's players that I just don't feel like are underrated. So I'm going with Matthew Joseph. Now, he only had 3 goals this past season, but what Joseph provides to Ottawa with his experience, also with his speed, and there's still some skill there. I think those 3 goals, I don't see any reason he can't hit at least 10 in a season. because the skill is there, the speed is there. It's just a matter of getting some puck luck. I think Joseph is, as stated, and it'll be in the title for this video, an underrated player. I thought about others, but I was like, Batherson doesn't really qualify. You can't say Stützle is underrated at this point, or I could just put everybody's superstar player on the board. But yeah, Joseph. Detroit. Detroit was pretty easy. Gotta be honest. I've talked about him since he was in St. Louis. Jake Wallman. I like Wallman. Detroit fans found out when Sherratt was switched out with Wallman on the other side with Seider, and all of a sudden Moritz Seider, who was having a rough year, wasn't having a rough year anymore. Wallman's numbers offensively are never going to wow anybody, but his overall play is really strong. And again, this is about guys that I don't think get the credit, and I don't think Wallman necessarily has. He's a very good defenseman, and I don't see any reason why for Detroit he can't be top four, that they can't leave him with Seider. We'll see. Every year's different, right? But we'll see where he ends up. Florida. Florida. A2, Luostarinen. Luostarinen, solid offensive player, not too shabby defensively either, gives you a little bit of everything. Florida's all about your counterattacking and your speed. They weren't as much about that this year as they were the year before until the playoffs, and then that came back. That's, all your turnovers ending up in the back of the other team's net. Like every time they forced a turnover, it was basically a goal. Luostarinen's pretty good, pretty solid forward. And I do think at this point in time in his career, probably underrated by a little bit. Could he score 20? Yep, absolutely. The work ethic's there. I think he could be a 20-goal scorer. For Washington, that's a whole other argument, though. I will do videos at some point on guys that I think probably overachieved last season, and then guys that I think from a fantasy perspective could be pretty good to pick up. All right, for Washington... So Trevor Van Riemsdyk has kind of bounced around a little bit, NHL-wise, but he's really found a home in Washington, and I think he had a fantastic year on a team that there weren't very many who had fantastic years. A frustrating year for the Capitals, but I think Van Riemsdyk did a pretty good job of establishing himself as a solid option for the Washington Capitals. Again, every year can be different. We'll see where he slots in this coming season. But I do like Trevor Van Riemsdyk, or TVR. James Van Riemsdyk, of course, JVR. Because there's times where I'll say TVR, JVR, and I just assume everybody knows who I'm talking about. In this case, Trevor Van Riemsdyk. There is no other TVR, so I'm not sure what I'm saying in this case. But anyhow, Pittsburgh. There were a couple options I thought about. I actually thought about Pierre-Olivier Joseph, and I thought, well... Then I'd have both Josephs on the board. So I'm going to go with Marcus Pettersson, who played a lot more minutes than P.O. Joseph. Pettersson's not going to wow you offensively, but I think he's a good option defensively. His numbers are good, and yeah, there's not really a whole lot else to say other than a blue line in Pittsburgh that at times looks kind of shaky. I don't consider Pettersson to be one of the shakier ones. I think he's a solid option, and as Letang gets older and ages out, Pettersson's already playing some major minutes. I think that's just going to increase as the years go by. Philadelphia. Philadelphia was not easy because there's been a lot of movement and a lot of players, and I'm just going with guys who have been with this team for last season, will be with this team this season, and that was a rule. I was like, no, I'm not using anybody who's on a new team because we don't know how it's going to go on the new team until it's actually, we see him on the ice. There are plenty of cases where a player switches teams. It does or it doesn't work. You just can't tell. But with Philadelphia, I feel like at this point in time, Owen Tippett's a bit underrated because Philadelphia had a tire fire of a season and hasn't had just the one. They've had a couple of tire fire type of seasons. This year on the ice was actually better, but of course all the off ice stuff, and now you've got all the tumult in the roster. But Tippett's been fantastic. 27 goals. Defensively, he's not going to make you forget Patrice Bergeron. He's not going to replace Sean Couturier for any time that he's out, obviously. But Tippett offensively, and just as a good young forward, I think he's solid. And so, yeah, there he is on the board. For the New York Rangers, this one may not surprise people who've been fans of the channel for a while, but his name's going on the board. Ryan Lindgren. We talk a lot about Adam Fox. Part of what helps Adam Fox be Adam Fox is the play of Ryan Lindgren. A good offensive defenseman paired with a really good defensive defenseman, it works. And in New York's case, you have Fox and Lindgren who've known each other for a while. And Lindgren's play, I do think, is underrated. I've talked about this before. Lindgren is one of the toughest players in the National Hockey League. We've seen him play through injuries that look severe at the time, and yet he doesn't miss a shift. Or maybe he goes to the dressing room for 10 minutes and he comes back. And it's like, what in the heck? And it might be multiple times during the same game, and you're thinking, Ryan, you're gonna get killed out there. But if he can skate, he's playing. And when he does play, he's very good. So there are some players who might play through injury that it shows, and you're like, he shouldn't have played through that. It hurt his play. If Lindgren's played through injuries of like major variety, you wouldn't know. His play is really, really consistent. For the New York Islanders, the Islanders were difficult. Finding a player that I feel like is underrated, I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to use Wahlstrom because I don't know that Wahlstrom's underrated at this point. He only had like 7 goals, didn't quite play half the season. He missed a lot of time with injury. So I went with somebody that has been in the league for a long time. I went with Paul Mary. Paul Mary, if you look at his goals and points per game this past season, pretty good. He's a pretty good player. And we talk a lot about Lou Lamoriello and his reliance on older players and how that kind of flies in the face of how most successful teams are put together, where you have your young stars and a lot of youthful energy on that roster. But Paul Mary's been quite good for the Islanders. And for Lou, it's kind of worked. I know that, people may not like the idea that making the playoffs validates things in that case, but I think it does. I think if your team's still in the top half of the league, yes, it would be nice if the Islanders had more of that mix with the younger players, but it just works, and Paul Mary's part of what works. For New Jersey, so Eric Howell has bounced around the league. He, it feels like, has stopped bouncing around the league. That New Jersey may finally be that home that he has never had. Where he'll be there for a couple of years, and he moves on, then he moves on, then he moves on. Well, Howell is sticking around with New Jersey. And this is a Devils team that I think can win a Stanley Cup. It's just a matter of getting hot at the right time and having that right goaltender. Which, as Vegas showed this year, having a goaltender get hot at the right time, you just never know who it might be. It might be an Aiden Hill type. But Eric Howell has, I think, played his best hockey already with New Jersey this past season. And so we'll see if that continues into this year. But Howell has been a pretty solid pickup for them. Good move. Columbus. For Columbus, and I know people are going to look at this and go, what? Patrick Laine. Patrick Laine's goal scoring has dropped off. Absolutely. 22 goals this year. So the goal scoring Laine, and there's a lot of people, remember when Laine used to be a star and The reality is he's still around a point per game. The issue with Laine is staying healthy for a full season. If Laine can stay healthy for a full season, I do believe he can hit 40 goals, and I think he can hit 85 to 90 points. I do. I think he can. The fact he was near a point per game in I think it was 55 games he played this year. I think it was 52 points. Yeah, Laine is still a very good player in the NHL, and now I think he's veered into the realm of a little bit underrated. And again, if you're going to be doing the fantasy hockey this year, and I generally don't, I think Laine's a guy who's probably going to fall in some fantasy drafts because the goal scoring is not where people thought it would be, and he's known primarily as a goal scorer. His actual playmaking skill has seemingly gotten better, and I'm saying seemingly because it's not always that the playmaking gets better, just they're passing more. They may change the way they play the game. So it may not be that his passing game's got a lot better. He's just, altered his game a little bit, which is important if you want to stay in the National Hockey League, to be able to adapt your game. So full credit to Laine. And again, being near a point per game, I don't hear much about Laine anymore. Carolina. Stefan Noesen. Stefan Noesen had a very good year. I have to give credit to Noesen, too, that he paid his dues in the minors, and now it looks like he's sticking around in the NHL for a while. At least I would think so. I like Noesen a lot. At the start of the year, I was kind of confused as to how he was on their power play, but it worked at points. Like I think, I was probably underrating him myself, so he's on the board there as an underrated player. So there's the East. So today I did the East first, and now we'll do the West. On the St. Louis side of things, and again, St. Louis, it's not easy, so I'm picking Blaine. It might seem like an easy one, but I'm going to say this. Blaine, playing in St. Louis, looked as good as he did the last time he was in St. Louis, if not better, considering that his career was seen as probably being almost over with the Rangers. It didn't look like he was going to be in the NHL much longer, and, things are really falling off, and he'd had these injuries, and, he'll never be the same again. And then he goes back to St. Louis, and everything's great. Now, can he do it again this year? It'll be interesting to see over an 82-game schedule back in St. Louis if it works. But if it works, good on him. And either way, I think he's underrated at this point, at least a little bit. For Winnipeg. So Nate Schmidt, I'm not going to argue, is underpaid. He's not underpaid. But I will say he's a bit underrated. Nate Schmidt is not a fancy, flashy kind of defenseman. And, he signs that contract in Vegas, ends up in Vancouver. It doesn't work in Vancouver. He ends up in Winnipeg. And he doesn't get a lot of attention. But I think Nate Schmidt's a pretty solid defenseman for this team. And really, in all honesty, he's saying all the right things about Winnipeg right now. I wouldn't be surprised to see him in Winnipeg for years to come. Again, I know his contract is a bit high for what he does production-wise now. But it's not about contracts. This is about players that I feel like are underrated at this point. And I would say that of Schmidt. Arizona. I didn't think this would end up lining up. I didn't think this through. Schmaltz. So we go from Schmidt to Schmaltz. Good thing Schwartz isn't next, isn't it? But yeah, Schmaltz of Arizona. And this is where there may be some eye rolling from long-term THG viewers. I like Nick Schmaltz. He's already around a point per game this year too. And that line with Schmaltz playing with Hayden and Keller, that was a fantastic line. Looking forward to seeing if they can pick up where they left off in October. If they can, Arizona could win themselves some games. I think Schmaltz is an underrated forward in the NHL. I've thought this for ages, dating back to when Chicago traded him, and I said it then. I was like, I don't know why Schmaltz is getting traded. But the reality is, I think Schmaltz has found himself a home with the Arizona Coyotes. I'm glad he's still there. And, I mean, the off-ice stuff is as it is. But the players seem to really appreciate playing for this organization. And so we'll see how Schmaltz does. Chicago. Chicago was not easy. Gonna be honest, Chicago was not easy because finding a player that I can look at and say, now, he had a really good year. I wanted to put Radish on the board, and I thought, I don't know if Radish is underrated at this point. He's a 20-goal scorer. Does he do it again? Was he a 20-goal scorer because they didn't have that elite talent ahead of him, so he gets more ice time? So as Chicago gets healthier, does Radish's ice time drop off? Maybe. And that would probably affect his production. So for underrated, I'm putting up Mrazek. And I'll stand by this because I think Mrazek gave them good goaltending. This was a team that was not very good, but between Stalock and Mrazek, the goaltending was solid. Not fantastic. I'm not saying it was stellar and awesome, but Mrazek gave them some good games. And again, maybe it's a case where the contract overshadows the player, where people look at that contract for Mrazek and say, well, he's not worth the contract. You can still underrate a player. So overpaid and underrated is the thing. Should put that on a t-shirt. Anyways, Nashville. I'm overpaid and underrated. Yeah, I don't think people are going to want to wear that t-shirt. Anyways, Nashville. Nashville, this one was kind of easy for me because I think Tommy Novak had a very good season for them. I think that because it's Nashville and they had a down year, they missed the playoffs. And I think with them going through this retool they're going through or whatever's going to happen, it's easy to overlook Novak. But Novak's a pretty solid talent, and I think he's going to make people regret overlooking him. I do. I think he's going to be a pretty solid producer for Nashville, and we'll see if that is the case this year. Minnesota. Minnesota wasn't an easy one either. But Freddie Gaudreau. Freddie Gaudreau. On a team where you saw Marcus Foligno's production drop off, a couple others that the production drops. Gaudreau with, I think it was 19 goals this year. Really solid producer. Pretty good all around. Does a little bit of everything. He can move up and down the lineup. Freddie Gaudreau is the kind of guy that you need if you're a team that's dealing with cap problems. That he can fill in basically anywhere. Where it's like, all right, can you be two guys tonight? I don't know if he can do that, but if there's anybody in the league that would give it a shot, I would think Freddie would try. Yeah, I can just see him out in the hallway just trying really hard to split in two. But anyways, yeah, Gaudreau, I do think is underrated. And of course, that's Freddie Gaudreau. Johnny Gaudreau is over in Columbus here, where I've put Laine on the board, which I'm sure everybody will agree with me on. Dallas. Joni Hakanpää. Hakanpää had, I think, what impressed me with Hakanpää in Dallas this year was the offensive side of it. Now, that may not happen again this year. Maybe that's a mirage, sure. But Hakanpää gave them really good all-around play, and Dallas is a team that kept the puck out of its net pretty well. Ottinger deserves some credit. Wedgwood deserves some credit as the goaltenders, but that blue line was solid. So for me, it was between Lindell and Hakanpää, and I feel like Hakanpää is a little more underrated than Esa Lindell, although I don't think there's a wrong answer between the two of them. And I looked at the forwards and thought I don't see any of these forwards as being underrated at this point, although watch for Wyatt Johnston next year. Colorado. Colorado in this one may cause a few heads to turn. So I'm trying to figure this out. Jack Johnson, everywhere he plays, his play isn't great. And then he's in Colorado, and he's excellent. I don't know what the Avalanche do with Jack Johnson, but he's still in Colorado this coming season, and they're right. So Jack Johnson's had trying times everywhere, but it feels like in Colorado it works. And the team and the player have both seemingly realized this, and I think it's great. Again, Jack Johnson, not a player that I think I would have had on the board if he was playing anywhere else, but in Colorado, yeah, because it works. Look at his numbers. Look at his, like, the defensive side of it is plus minus that people don't like and everything. But still, Jack Johnson, I think is underrated in Colorado. Probably in part because there's other teams on the board who be like, Jack Johnson. Right, yeah, I get it. Vancouver. Okay, so for Vancouver, Dakota Joshua. Now, the numbers would not indicate how well Joshua played for the Canucks because it was a bit of a trial at times. But by the end of the season, he was providing them some pretty good depth. And I think on that third line, which was the vision when they picked him up, they envisioned him as being part of a really strong third line. That can work. If Joshua and if Teddy Bluger's that third line center, whoever else you get on that wing, whether it's Podkolzin, maybe Höglander, I think Joshua's numbers could be pretty good this year. Not saying like 20, 25 goals good, but he had 11 goals this season. I think he could hit 15. I'll say I think he could hit 15. And I think it was a pretty astute addition by the Vancouver Canucks. So looking forward to seeing what he can do in another season in a Vancouver uniform. So for LA, this one's not really going to surprise people. If you're a Kings fan, you probably knew this name was coming at the start of the video. Mikey Anderson. Mikey Anderson, defensively, fantastic. Offensively, underrated. Overall, underrated. I've been a big fan of his for years, and he is getting paid the way that he should be for the LA Kings. And again, Kings fans generally seem to love the guy, but around the rest of the NHL, I don't know how many fans aren't aware of how good Mikey Anderson is. However, when he signed the contract extension with the Kings, I found they don't know how good he is. They don't know how good he's excellent. So, while yes, LA may have some cap issues, I wouldn't look at Anderson's contract and say, well, that's one that they should pitch, because no. I'm going to do a video at some point soon on if every team had a compliance buyout, who would they buy out? That I think could be entertaining. And then I'm going to get into what a compliance buyout was and why people want them back. But Mikey Anderson, not on that list. Calgary. Again, so I go from Schmidt to Schmaltz. And here we go from Mikey Anderson to Rasmus Anderson. A lot of defensemen on this list. And it is a lot of the time because they're overshadowed by another defenseman on their own team. In this case, Rasmus Anderson I don't think gets the kind of press and attention that he should. Excellent blue liner, capable of 50 to 60 points, and pretty good shot, pretty good all-around defenseman. Honestly, Calgary's defense has been really quite good for years. The numbers don't necessarily support that from this past season, but I do think Rasmus Anderson is he their best defenseman, or is Noah Hanifin the best defenseman? I actually thought about putting up Hanifin. I did. But I think of Hanifin and Anderson, I think Anderson's probably a little more underrated than Hanifin. You guys can let me know. There are no wrong answers, right? I know people in the comments down below are going to be like, I can't believe you picked this guy. You're wrong. Oh, okay. It's positive. Positive video. How dare you? How dare you? I said, how dare you, sir? Good day. All right. For Anaheim, another defenseman. Cam Fowler. I love Cam Fowler's game. Veteran defenseman. And while John Gibson is ready to move on, he is also willing to play. If you've heard the rumor that John Gibson said he'll never play another game in the Anaheim jersey, it's not true. But Fowler, if Fowler came out tomorrow and said, I want a chance to win, I'd like to move on, I don't think people would be bothered by that so much. He's paid his dues. But I've never heard it from him, and I don't think we will. Cam Fowler's giving that veteran presence on the blue line that every team needs going through a rebuild. And he's been pretty good. So Fowler, I think, is underrated at this point in his career. For San Jose, this was not an easy one either. San Jose, finding somebody that's underrated that I feel like, pretty good player, doesn't get as much press. It's tough. I thought about Vlasic, to be honest. But the numbers, I don't know that backs up the idea that Vlasic's underrated at this point. I don't think Vlasic is as bad as people think he is at times. But I went with Nico Sturm in San Jose. I think Sturm provides them with decent depth scoring. And again, with San Jose, it was tough for me to find somebody and say really and truly underrated. Maybe Ferraro. Ferraro's one that, yes, maybe I could have thrown on the board, but I'll stand by Sturm. No problem with that. Vegas. Coming out of winning a Stanley Cup, it's hard to find a player that you can say, well, this guy's underrated. But Zach Whitecloud, his ability to shut things down from coming from the other end, very, very good. Both Haig and Whitecloud came into their own during that Stanley Cup playoffs run for the Vegas Golden Knights. And really, in all honesty, I think Whitecloud's worth a lot of money. I think he's absolutely an underrated defenseman. And defending Stanley Cup champions need those. I think, again, I could have made the argument for Haig. I'm going to say with Whitecloud, I think his defensive game is excellent. I think offensively, he's pretty good too. Not great, but pretty good. And it's a good story because it took a while, but it feels like now he's really put himself into a spot where he's absolutely top six for Vegas. And, good things come to those who wait. Edmonton. For Edmonton, this one I didn't really have to think about. I did have to look at my paper to see what I wrote down because I'm old. But Warren Foegele had a very good season. Edmonton, of course, parting ways with Puljujarvi during the season. Moving on from Yamamoto. Costin's gone. Fogel's still here. Warren Foegele is a very good, hardworking forward. The work ethic is higher than the offensive side of things, but the work ethic leads to scoring opportunities. And he's not going to wow you with goals and points, but just the effort. The effort is fantastic with Foegele, and that's a key thing. Absolutely a key thing. And rounding things out, Seattle. So from Seattle, a former Oiler goes on the board, Adam Larsson. I think Larsson had his best season in the National Hockey League this past year, and I think he warrants mention on the board as basis for that. And really, Seattle's defense is underrated overall, like whether you're looking at Alexiak. Dunn, I think, was underrated coming into this season. The points he put up means not anymore. Everybody knows. But Larsson, just absolutely ridiculous season for him. He has been a very good investment for the Seattle Kraken. And again, you want to get into underrated blue lines? I think Seattle's right there. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.